Nostalgia is a bizarre phenomenon, a sudden overflow of bittersweet emotion stemming from memories or affection for the past. Nostalgia is a feeling that can be related to lots of memories, and not only of memories traditionally associated with nostalgia, like a happy time period or a location often visited in the past. Nostalgia can also apply to experiences with other people, or, as I will discuss, to pieces of media. Music is the most common and perhaps intense example of this, but it is also possible to be nostalgic for example, a TV series one used to watch with friends or family. This type of nostalgia, though, is usually something generated not only by the media itself, but also the time period during which it was consumed and the people with which it was consumed. So, how does this relate to video games? Well, most nostalgia related to pieces of media falls into a similar category, being described not only by the media itself, but also outside factors like I just described. However, this is not the case with video games. Of course, outside factors can influence one's remembrance of a video game in just the same way, but due to their immersive qualities and unique ability among media to provide an active rather than passive consumer experience, the biggest factors to nostalgic feelings towards video games are generally the games themselves. It's common online to hear gamers reminisce about their first experiences with various games, which can be particularly nostalgic due to the novelty of a first playthrough from both a gameplay and a narrative perspective. What caught my mind's eye recently, though, is the ability for games to create a feeling of nostalgia even when none should, at least theoretically, exist. Certain games have a way of creating a sort of artificial nostalgia to bolster their own atmosphere or hammer home narrative themes, even if players haven't yet forged a personal nostalgic connection with said games after playing them. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about BioShock and Fallout. Now, while there's lots of factors contributing to the nostalgia factor for these games, music is the most representative and impactful single element here, which is even more perplexing because an overwhelming majority of the player audience of either game would not have experienced the release and popularity of such songs as each of the franchises employ, and so likely have no memory whatsoever of or emotional connection to them. With all of this in mind, I've done a bunch of actual research here to try and explain how each of these franchises are able to generate this artificial nostalgia, and what role music plays in that. To explain how all this happens, I'll be analyzing design elements like art direction, soundtrack, and even a bit of gameplay, but before diving into all this, we first need to understand what exactly nostalgia itself is. Alright, so here's where the research part of this video comes in. I'm gonna start by saying that nostalgia was not always categorized as an emotion. According to this here psychology article I found in my research, nostalgia was historically understood as a psychiatric disorder, characterized by symptoms such as anorexia, anxiety, sadness, and insomnia, and then later marked as a subcategory of depression. Now, obviously, that's not the case, and so through a variety of studies conducted primarily between 2006 and 2007, the writers of that same article concluded that nostalgia is, in fact, a widespread and common phenomenon in humans, better described as a positive emotion relating to sentimentality, rather than a psychiatric disorder. Pretty big difference there. After conducting their own survey, the authors found that while nostalgia does carry some negative affect, it is a predominantly positive emotion. And so here's probably the most important thing I found out from this article. They note that nostalgia is most often triggered by negative moods and loneliness. The team's findings about the triggers of nostalgia seem to be right in line with BioShock and Fallout, particularly regarding loneliness. Both games are set in worlds where most creatures and people are hostile, and there are few face-to-face interactions with passive characters, except for in very specific, contained, scripted environments, which means that for the majority of their experience, the player will be alone, creating the emotional setup for nostalgia. This is bolstered by each game's sense of isolation, especially BioShock, where you're literally isolated in an underwater city. Both games are also clearly related to that sentimentality aspect of nostalgia too. Each one presents the player with a world that has clearly lost something, nearly everything. The dilapidated buildings of the post-nuclear war in Fallout, or the dented, leaking, rusty hallways of BioShock that threaten to cave in at any moment. It is very clear that both worlds were once great, near utopian societies, and so there is something for the protagonist, and through immersion the player, to be sentimental about, with all this disrepair on display. This is especially the case in Fallout 4, as the game starts soon before the bombs drop, rather than after, giving players a more tangible view of the idyllic neighborhood of Sanctuary Hills, and what might lie beyond before taking it all away. Despite all of these elements though, there is still no explanation for how nostalgia is created in each game. While there is a sentimental aspect to each game and the loneliness factor is there, someone playing one of these games for the very first time would of course not have had the time to build an emotional connection to a world they've only just been introduced to, let alone to become nostalgic for it, at least not through personal nostalgia. The stage has been set, so to speak, with the elements of loneliness and sentimentality, but neither of these elements can reliably create that air of nostalgia that BioShock and Fallout exude, but rather serve to amplify it once it has already been generated. That brings me to two conclusions. First, although the stage is set through the worlds of the games, another element of design must be acting as the trigger for nostalgia. Second, the nostalgia that someone can feel from BioShock and Fallout is a nostalgia that does not stem from personal experiences. This also all brings me to the next main topic of this video: music. To understand how the music of BioShock and Fallout link to their nostalgia factors, I continued my research through this book and this article. I'll begin with what I found in Batcho's article. The most relevant finding here was that nostalgia is more heavily linked to and amplified by lyrics with happy themes in music, and lyrics also with other-directed rather than solitary themes. This is significant because after going through each game's licensed soundtracks, the majority of diegetic, non-instrumental songs from both BioShock 1 and Fallout 4 have either other-directed or happy lyrical themes, often accompanied by upbeat instrumentals as well. From BioShock's 17 licensed songs with lyrics, only 4 of them do not contain other-related or happy themes. Of Fallout 4's 42 licensed songs with lyrics, a larger portion of songs do not contain such themes, but there are still 30 songs that do, and of the 12 that don't, 10 still have upbeat instrumentals. Of course, it should also be said that some of the songs have directly nostalgic themes as well, such as Maybe by the Ink Spots or Beyond the Sea by Bobby Darin. Both songs recount the longing feeling of two separated lovers reminiscing on their old times together. Additionally, there is a sharp contrast and a level of irony between the generally uplifting and lighthearted songs featured and the derelict buildings and landscapes on display. By having such songs permeating through the decrepit, post-disaster worlds of these games, there is a constant reminder that intensifies that feeling of loss and sentimentality. The music heard exhibits an indifference to the immediate tone of the games, something that the imperfections of the musical recordings only serve to exacerbate, with record scratches and tinny radios playing in the background of rooms and hallways, reminding us of a past that is distant but still tangible. Given everything I just said, it is safe to say that most songs from BioShock 1 and Fallout 4 have the potential to amplify nostalgic feelings due to their lyrical content. But again, such lyrics work to amplify, not create, nostalgic feelings, just like the elements of loneliness and sentimentality present in gameplay and world. So what is it then that triggers all of these elements? Well, the book I mentioned earlier finally answered that question for me. The most significant finding here in relation to this research is that nostalgia can be created through music, not only with that music's relation to memories of one's own past, but of a nebulous and romanticized version of the past outside our own experience. The book states that music has the capacity to create something called historical nostalgia, something it defines as a desire for the past, albeit a version of the past that may be built on largely fictitious concepts. This suggests that music does not have to have the context of relevancy to a listener's own life to generate nostalgia. It can also be music representative of family memories or one's romanticized perception of a past that they did not experience directly, meaning music can act as both an amplifier, as noted by the article I went into earlier, and also a trigger of nostalgia as noted by this book, which is exactly how BioShock and Fallout 4 use their soundtracks. Both games call upon music from a time period long enough ago that most players would not have experienced it, but near enough to the present that players will be familiar with the defining traits of that time that have survived, such as songs by famous artists of the 1940s through 60s, like Ella Fitzgerald or Bing Crosby, whose names are still commonly known today. This allows some level of familiarity to be called upon through that nebulous and romanticized version of the past that has been passed down generations. Of course, both games in question call upon similar art styles for their worlds, reflective of popular artistic movements in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s in the USA. Now, one of the studies recounted in the book I mentioned earlier concluded that people that like historically representative items such as art, fashion, and film tend to prefer music with a less direct link to themselves, such as music that their grandparents may have listened to. And this is what BioShock and Fallout do with their environmental designs. By surrounding players with historically representative items, such as Rapture's architecture, or the advertisements of BioShock's plasmids and Fallout 4's Nuka-Cola that mimic the Art Deco and pop art movements of the 1930s through 50s, the games artificially create this music preference that I just mentioned, and therefore are capable of generating historical nostalgia through their soundtracks. Even if a player doesn't have any historical nostalgic connection whatsoever to the time periods mentioned, the games are able to artificially create even this through their worlds and art direction. The diegetic music heard during gameplay triggers nostalgic emotion through historical rather than personal experience and is felt so intensely even by new players due to all of the elements I've been discussing that have the potential to amplify feelings of nostalgia. Player isolation, historically representative environments, the post-apocalyptic settings, the ironic soundtracks. Although the nostalgia being generated is, in effect, artificial, the amount of amplifying elements present and working together create a thick atmosphere of loss and sentimentality that really drives these games and makes their nostalgia feel real.
I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart. In my heart I have but one desire, and that one is you. No other will